When you think of the civil rights, some of the most important names that you remember are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X. For this assignment, I chose to remember Charles Hamilton Houston, one of the most prominent and refined attorneys of the 20th century. AmericanHistory.com quoted that he was one of the most influential figures in African American life between the two world wars. And he was a scholar, a lawyer, and he was dedicated his life to freeing his people from the bonds of racism. He was a dean of Howard University Law School and the NAACP litigation director. He played a significant role in dismantling the Jim Crow laws, which he earned him the title "The Man Who Killed Jim Crow," and that was quoted by Krauss of National Geographic. Houston was well known for training a generation of black attorneys, including future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was responsible for winning the famous Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, which legally abolished segregation in schools. Without the mentorship, training, and leadership of Houston in the civil rights movement, segregation and legal oppression of African Americans could still be prevalent in America today. Background on Charles Hamilton Houston: he was born in 1895 to a middle-class family in Washington, D.C. His father, William Houston, conducted a private law practice and taught evening law classes at Howard University. His mother, Mary Houston, operated a hairdressing salon for Washington, D.C.'s elite. Charles Hamilton Houston attended one of the nation's most acclaimed secondary schools, M Street High, which was quoted by McNeil by saying it was the first built exclusively public school for black students by public funds. He graduated from M Street High at 15 years old. He attended Amherst College, where he completed his undergrad, and then he later graduated with honors from Harvard Law, where he studied he had a bachelor's degree in law and also a doctorate in judicial science. Houston was a natural leader, and because of that, he enlisted in the United States Army as an officer rather than face the draft. He decided to do this so he could lead black units. He and other African American college graduates asked for separate training facilities so they could personally lead black units. This would prove that blacks were capable of leading and would earn the respect of the Army's Department of War. Houston returned from the war with an anger caused by racist behaviors he experienced from the war. He learned that unless the entire system changed from within the United States, nothing would change for African Americans. So from returning from the war, Houston began working at Howard University Law School. He also joined his father's practice, where it was called Houston and Houston, Attorneys at Law. He stated for Houston, he understood the responsibility that he had as a lawyer. Tyner had stated that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society, and that was Houston's famous coined phrase because he understood how important that position was in society as a lawyer. Houston knew that in order to fight for justice and civil rights, he would have to improve Howard as well and improve the students. He was known as a notorious disciplinarian and extraordinary professor. He pushed his students not to just become good lawyers, but to be great lawyers. Houston even encouraged Howard University to increase the tuition and toughen academic standards for their law program. This would bring in the type of students he preferred, as well as single out the best candidates for Howard Law. He convinced himself that Howard would play a crucial role in the future advancement of African Americans. Some of the alumni included Thurgood Marshall, Robert Carter, Spotswood Robinson. One of the young attorneys under Houston's mentorship, who was heavily responsible for strategically planning and winning the case for Brown versus Board of Education, was Thurgood Marshall. Marshall quoted that Houston would not be satisfied until he went to a dance on the campus and found all of his law students sitting around the walls reading law books instead of partying. So that tells you a lot about Houston. These young men would forge a team of the brightest lawyers this country has ever seen. They would win many civil rights cases against segregation of schools. And AmericanHistory.com stated that case by case, their efforts began to undermine the legal principle of separate but equal. In 1935, Houston joined the NAACP as special counsel. He brought the same energy to the NAACP that he brought to Howard University. With a team of intelligent and talented lawyers, they formed the LDF, which is the Legal Defense and Educational Fund Incorporated. Houston's overall objective was to destroy separate but equal in the United States. Houston decided to take a backseat role due to health reasons. Krauss stated that throughout the 1940s, the lawyers built a case against segregation. Marshall was appointed head of the NAACP's legal team in 1940, and over the next decade won cases that proved that in black and white schools, teachers' salaries were not equal, nor was equal money spent on individual students. Houston unfortunately died of heart failure in 1950. He did not live to see the death of Jim Crow, but in 1952, Thurgood Marshall argued the case Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court consolidated 5 cases under one name, Oliver Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The case that would become Brown versus Board of Education was actually 5 cases represented segregated public elementary and high schools in Washington, D.C., Delaware, Virginia, and South Carolina. In 1954, Marshall and company would go on to win the case in which this victory would legally end segregation in public schools in America. In conclusion, after the Brown decision, racial equality was far from over. Many of the civil rights activists came after Houston to continue to fight for equality. Marshall and many others who fought these cases were still fighting for men and women of color throughout the United States. We still battle major race and gender issues to this day. And it was actually quoted by Zimmerman that although school integration plans were put in place in the late 1960s and early 1970s all across the nation, subsequent social and demographic shifts have once again created segregated schools. Houston's legacy impacts African Americans, and many others have more opportunities than ever before. His contribution achieved so much for the civil rights movement and racial equality in the mid-20th century.